Who has the advantage, Democrats or Republicans, when it comes to young voters? Two pieces in the New York Times in the past few weeks raising some big questions about the future of American politics. The first piece, entitled "Why Teenagers Today May Grow Up Conservatives," suggests that young people may not always vote as heavily Democratic as they have in the past few elections, and that eventually more young people may become more conservative and vote GOP. Well, now another piece by the same writer, a week later in the New York Times, says new polling suggests there's not much evidence that the young are leaning more conservative, at least not yet. So what's the truth here? Paul Taylor is a senior fellow at the Pew Research Center and author of a recently published book called The Next America that deals exactly with this generational question we're asking. So, Paul, it's great to have you on the program to ask you a little bit about this. The commonly held belief, of course, is that young people are going to be liberal, they're going to be Democrat. Is that true for this generation that's coming up in this political environment we're in?
You know, that's an aphorism that's always true except when it isn't. It has been true. It has been true for this generation. If you track today's young adults, those in their mid-20s to 30s, they're old enough to have voted in a few presidential elections. They are the most Democratic, big D, voting cohort of any cohort of young adults we have seen. If you go just one generation to the so-called Gen Xers, they came in as a more conservative voting bloc. So that's the history so far. But there's another truth about these young voters that stands alongside that, and that is, despite that voting, despite their liberal views on a lot of political and social issues, they don't choose to identify with either the Democratic or the Republican Party. A record share call themselves independent, and to that extent, they are somewhat up for grabs.
Let me just stop you there. If they're up for grabs, who seems to have the upper hand in getting them to come to their side, even if they say, listen, I'm an independent, I'm not going to register Democrat or Republican?
Well, if you look at their policy beliefs, you would have to say the Democrats have the upper hand. But all voters, including young voters, also reward or punish on the basis of performance. And if you look at the performance of Washington over the last 5 or 6 years, which is the years that these young adults have come of age, they look at Washington and they say the place isn't working very well. In fact, they're very turned off by it. I think that hurts both parties, but I think it particularly hurts the Democrats because Barack Obama is the president of the United States. He is, in effect, the leader of the in party. He encouraged a lot of young adults 5 or 6 years ago to believe that he could bring hope and change the way politics works. I think the verdict is that hasn't happened, and there may be some political fallout for that for his party.
Interesting. That's one of the things that the New York Times was talking about in the first piece about why young people may be more conservative is the fact that government performance overall is not so good, and you have a Democrat in the White House. And so the question that was being raised as we look forward to 2016, are these voters truly up for grabs? And I'm curious, Paul, as you look at this group, when in the past, if you were a Democrat at 18, 19, 20, does that mean that you're going to be a Democrat for the rest of your life? And is that true of this group, or does it seem that people are really changing with every election?
That's another truth that's true until it isn't. I think if you look at people in my generation, the baby boomers, they were liberal and Democratic, most of them, not all of them, as we came of age in our 20s and 30s. Pew Research Center did a poll of all adults a few months ago asking them what has happened to you in your political views over the course of your lifetime, and the majority of boomers said, I've gotten more conservative. I think another reality about today's young adults is they don't park themselves with a brand at the beginning of their lives and say, I'm sticking with it forever, whether it's a political party, whether it's an automobile, whether it's a cereal. They live in an era where technological change happens almost overnight. Their DNA is attuned to that. They are grazers. They're ready for the next big thing, and which means I don't think that you can assume they're parked in any place. I do think there's one reason, however, that it is more likely than not that they will remain liberal, and that is because a record share of this generation of young adults is non-white. About 43% of so-called millennials are non-white. If you look at their younger brothers and sisters, you're looking at a majority of youngsters, kids today, are non-white. And if you look at the way those voting patterns have played out over the last 40 or 50 years, you see the non-white constituents, blacks, Hispanics, and Asian Americans, are heavily Democratic. And unless the Republican Party finds a way to crack that code, then they are looking at ever-increasing demographic challenges.
What about the libertarian point of view? Because that certainly has been a strong thread within the Republican Party. And you've mentioned that there's a lot of disillusionment with the federal government. Does that seem to resonate with young people regardless of what race they are? Does that seem to be something that is strong if you're looking at what will bring a certain group, a certain age, to one side or the other?
Yeah, I think you see strands of libertarianism among all age groups, particularly among young adults. I don't think it rises at this point to a majority opinion. I think within the Republican Party, we're seeing it this week. You have this fissure between the libertarians on foreign policy, who sort of are more isolationist, and the hawks, who are more aggressive. I think that's an issue for the Republican Party for all voters to work out. And again, among the minorities, among young adults, I don't think you see much libertarianism. Minorities in this country genuinely tend to think government is a good thing. It's there to protect us. It's there to provide services. And that's not a libertarian point of view.
It's very interesting. I'll forever now think of the young voters as grazers, Paul, because of what you had to say, picking and choosing as they go along throughout their lives. Great to see you, and look forward to having you back on the program. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.